Now I'd like to introduce Chris Dowling as our first speaker today. Dr. Chris Dowling has been involved in soil fertility and crop nutrition research and extension for over 45 years, originally in the fertiliser industry and more recently in his current role in a private agricultural software and services company, Paddock, based in Queensland. Chris's passion is turning soil fertility and crop nutrition research outcomes into integrated and practical tools for the advisor and grain grower. He's been a long-term advocate of the use of plant tissue testing, not only as a tool for troubleshooting, but for managing changes to plant nutrient availability based on the philosophy that a plant will generally tell you how it's feeling about change before the soil will reflect it. And if you ask the right questions at an appropriate time, hence sampling is critical. And I think Chris is going to start with a bit of a giving us the story on the new guide. Chris, I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending this. It's as Luke introduced, plant tissue sampling to me is one of the most underused tools in agriculture, particularly in the area that I work mostly in broadacre. Obviously used a lot more in some other areas of agriculture, but I just wonder sometimes as to what the nature of, why people aren't using plant tissue testing. And I think that poll probably indicated that we're going to talk about sampling today, and it was only 28% of the issue. So there's people out there that'll probably appreciate what we've got to say about the project Doris and I have been involved with Fertiliser Australia in developing a sampling guide for plants, but it probably speaks to the problem seems to be in the 50%, just in the competency and the confidence of people in the process of using plant samples and interpreting them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because, as my title slide there says, is it part of a black art or is it essential agronomic skill? I think some people look at it as a black art because it's just not as straightforward maybe as soils to come up with a interpretation and even more a recommendation. And it does work. And I want to work through a little bit to start with about where the science is in this. And convince people that it is a worthwhile exercise, and it starts with sampling. So the way we're going to run this, Doris, I'm going to talk a little bit about broadacre, some broad concepts to start with. I'm going to talk about plant sampling in broadacre, and Doris is going to follow up with some perspectives from the more intensive horticultural industries. So what I would like to acknowledge to start with is this talk was, I suppose, spawned from the fact that Doris and I were working on a project for Fertiliser Australia to create a companion volume of information about plant sampling for agriculture, as was published a couple of years about soil sampling. So trying to pull together all of the reference material that's out there and put it into a practical guide to guide people through the sampling part of interpretation, and also incorporate some of the more modern thinking about sampling in relation to using tools that relate to precision ag and those sorts of things. So this is pretty much an overview, and this particular guide is, I think Jeff gave us Clark, who briefed us on this, gave us a sort of a maximum of 40 pages, but it did end up a little longer than that to make sure we covered all of the information that was available and potentially looking into the future. So, what's the science of the P&A is plant nutrient analysis. We call it plant tissue analysis, but with the things like tissue testing for disease and nematodes and all sorts of other things that we do now, I've switched to talking about plant nutrient analysis rather than just broadly plant tissue analysis. And the science is solid, I'd have to say. what we're doing is what it's doing is complementing soil analysis. It's not anywhere in competition, and it can do that. And as was explained, my experience would suggest that the plant is able to respond to a management change either faster or just it can respond to management change in nutrient availability faster than you'll pick it up in a soil test. So, what is it based on? It's based on the fact that there is science that says that the plant nutrient concentration we measure can explain differences in plant growth with a relative degree of reliability. And if you look at the types of R-squareds, you might say, well, they're not up there with medical type certainty, but they're certainly up there with the types of R-squareds we get from soil tests. So, it is a valid science, and it's just a matter of following the process to make it work. And the big difference between plant analysis and soil analysis is frequently we don't necessarily have a direct relationship between the status of the plant and what rate of nutrient we might need to remedy the situation, whereas we do have calculations like that for soil analysis. So, the science is usually pretty good, and we see on the left-hand side the sort of relationships that we're describing for a critical range. And you'll notice rather than describing soils, we're talking about a part of the plant at a stage. And this is pretty key in sampling, is it is probably even tighter in plant analysis to make sure you understand what plant part and what sampling timing in the phenology or on a date basis that we're dealing with, because that relationship will break down, if we get that incorrect, it'll break down the interpretability of the data faster than it will by getting soil tests wrong by whether I should take it in December or April. That's very, very critical in this situation. So what we end up with a whole heap of these type responses. If you put them together, we end up with a plant that's either deficient, marginally deficient, sufficient, or we get out to the other extreme, excessive or toxic. So some of the terminology we hear, we've got a critical concentration, we've got a critical range, and either side we've got concentrations that will cause growth, or concentrations in the plant that would suggest that the growth might be either limited by that nutrient not being available or too much of it being available. So the science is there. There's lots of publications. There's going back quite a while, and as far as publications around the world, we have had a good lot in recent years, starting with Reuter and Robinson in 1996, an Australian publication that basically set the guidelines for sampling, but also interpretation criteria. Not all that easy to interpret as far as a process, and I wonder that some people end up in problems in using the data in there in its raw form. Can be a little bit misleading if you don't interpret it correctly, particularly around the notes as to where it was and the sampling time and the plant part that we used. So the plant nutrient analysis process follows exactly the same as soil sampling, that we've got sampling, laboratory analysis, data interpretation, and then plant nutrient management tactics that come from the interpretation. It is very critical when determining what I should do about sampling, making sure you understand the interpretation data that you're going to be coming from first. As I indicated previously, if you get the wrong plant part at the wrong time, it becomes uninterpretable. So sampling's the first part in the process, but really the first step is understand for the crop or the pasture or whatever you're going to sample, what options you have for interpretive data before you go out and sample. You know, there's times it's better to do it with different plant parts, more so than others. So for information, you know, really, Reuter and Robinson, Lab Guides, industry publication, but this new plant sampling for agriculture is an attempt to update and standardise the plant sampling part. Laboratory analysis, once again, ASPAC proficiency. It is plant analysis is subject to the same interlaboratory efficiency or accreditation. So, you know, you can look that up to see which laboratories are able to do that. Interpretation guidelines, most recent one on an international scale is a publication from the US, which is Bryson et al., which is really an update of the 1990s publication. And then you know, one of the, I suppose, the unfortunate situations is that data interpretation of plant management tactics really comes down to advisor skill. And that's the bit that, you know, that it seems to be the gap, and we in the survey were saying that is probably the biggest gap, and it's probably the biggest opportunity to help raise numbers and you know, move forward from an agronomic skills point of view. Just moving on to my perspective as far as why, in a broadacre sense, why people probably aren't using plant tissue analysis as frequently as they might. I've got a bit of my placement of, you know, the frequency of use and for people to use plant tissue in broadacre and the interpretation difficulty. And what I would say is most frequently people use plant tissue analysis. They pull it out when something goes wrong and something looks wrong in the plant, so they use it for troubleshooting. Either that, they use it to predict if the plant's going to run out, occasionally to monitor, and this is probably something that you might say, okay, well, cotton nitrogen PDLs is a monitoring approach, and that's one of the ones that is, but regular monitoring in broadacre, I would say, is very rare, which means taking more than one sample across a season. Compliance through some legislative is not used very much, and change management, which I'll talk a bit about later, is hardly used at all, but it may be in the future. As far as interpretation difficulty, compliance is probably the easiest, because you've got a set of guidelines that are provided by somebody, and they say, do your samples meet that compliance guideline? If it's yes, you're compliant. If it's no, it's not. So compliance is pretty easy. Monitoring, relatively easy, because you're actually taking numbers over time and looking at the direction of the slope of a nutrient concentration in plant over time, which takes away the worry and the wonder about whether that single sample was truly representative of what was going on in that situation. I'd say change management, it comes next, and you know, the problem we've got is people are using these things for troubleshooting, and yet I would, in my experience, say as far as interpreting what's going on, it is the most difficult. So we've got this intersection of high frequency, difficult to interpret, and what that usually ends up with is the answer to the problem that you're trying to troubleshoot is not immediately available or not really obvious, and people doubt that the usefulness of plant analysis. It really comes down to training and understanding the physiology and the biochemistry of how plants react to deficiencies, and how to work through that in the way that nutrients display in a report. So, you know, this is generally what I see when people, you know, send me photos and say, what's this? Should I do a plant tissue test? And I said, my normal answer is, yeah, go ahead and do it, but don't expect that the answer will stick out clearly, because frequently that's too late. Once you get symptoms, there's that much disruption to the biochemistry of the plant. The actual cause can be masked by other interactions. And unless you know about those interactions and have come across them before, or that deficiency symptom has been seen before, it mightn't line up with the plant that's the plant tissue tests that come back. And it's not unusual in that situation to see someone takes one out of a good area and a poor area, and the one that comes out of the good area looks like it's one that, you know, the question is whether the lab got the samples mixed up, because the one that's supposed to be deficient isn't showing that. So, you know, if you're troubleshooting, be very careful and make sure you understand, you know, the process of working through what might be a totally biochemically disrupted plant and what other nutrients might be affected by that. Also, when taking into account plants, remember that the plant is actually reflecting the season-long concentration of nutrients that it's seen so far. And the availability of those nutrients is affected by a whole heap of different interacting factors. Now, that might be a whole heap of data, and you go, well, that's just too much to integrate. Mostly you don't have to, because a lot of those in any particular situation can be ruled out. But that's part of the process of interpreting plant analysis, is taking into account there is an above and below ground environment that's affecting that plant. There's above and below ground plant characteristics and genetics that are affecting that, that result. And over the top of that, we've overlaid some management activities. But in all of this, the difference between soil and plant analysis is we are using a probe and sticking it into the ground in certain places and depths to re-establish a relationship that was found in the field between that probe and how the plant responded for a particular nutrient. The difference with the plant is we're using the plant roots to actually sample what the above ground parts are saying about the availability of nutrients. And that's very, very different. And we really need to understand the root system at the time we sample to make sure we're doing it at the right time, not just the physiology of the plant, because root activity, density, depth, activity are all important in understanding why the plant's reacting the way that it is, because it is the sampling mechanism. So just something I've come across in the broadacre sense. You know, when is it right to sample in relation to roots and when it's not? And I've sort of, when is, you know, we want to know about plant nutrient function. When is it important in the plant? When is it less important? What's the nutrient uptake flux? So when's the peak uptake? Are the soil nutrients stratified in some way? Have we got a soil test, or do we understand it's a stratification nutrients, immobile, phosphorus, zinc, compared to nitrogen, maybe sulfur, boron, soil water distribution relative to nutrient, and the root location. So, you know, when we start to look at the scenarios, we've got a stratification that looks like this, nothing in the surface, and it's increasing with depth, then it's not time to sample a young plant for a mobile nutrient like nitrogen, particularly if the stratification is nitrogen, until the plant roots actually reach where that nitrogen might be. It'll come up short, but there's a great degree of surety, if we've got moisture down the profile, that it will grow into that and may grow out of any symptoms that were there previously. So that's the one we've got to be very careful of. The other situations, you know, generally we're okay. So if we've got stratified in the surface and we're testing for phosphorus and zinc, that'll be okay. Phosphorus and zinc, if it's mostly going to be a higher concentration in the surface, you know, it's probably going to get through on that situation as well. But there are certainly situations where we should, and nitrogen being a big component of what people are trying to manage, stratification like that, you've got to know where the roots are. So knowing where they are, what plant part, and the timing, we come up with something that's going to sample the plant when it's seeing the maximum or the start of the increase in nutrient supply, and we're wanting to make sure it's not going to run out. Remember, we're taking a sample of the plant up to date. If the plant grows into more nutrients, then the low nutrient status of the plant may well go away later on, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to predict if the nutrient's going to affect yield at the end of the season, which has an assumption that that nutrient supply won't increase unless management increases it, not the soil supply increases it. So some other considerations are looking at which plant part, and this is a plot of some work I was doing with wheat, looking at all the data I could gather about the critical ranges for whole tops in wheat for nitrogen. And you can see one of the concerns I have is if someone actually picked whole tops for wheat from about growth stage 25 to 35, the slope of the actual decrease may actually be overcome by the sampling error. So I would be suggesting, unless you also have a plant weight, in other words, you're using a system where you're using a nutrient index that uses both plant weight and concentration, that for nitrogen for whole tops, this is probably an area to actually avoid. Early on, no problems. Later on, the slopes are less, therefore the time between being adequate and not adequate is greater, and therefore any errors in sampling are not as critical. So if you compare that to Youngest expanded blades, you can see the slope is far less steep, and therefore during that critical period, the concentration really only changes a small amount. So a lot more stable for nitrogen at that stage, probably not as accurate in the earlier stages than having this sort of relationship available. So just be careful, as I said, understanding the interpretation data in relation to sampling is very, very important. Some other things that are coming up that I think, will probably head people to using plant analysis in the future, just some special case sampling, deep banding of phosphorus. Once you put that deep band in the soil, the conundrum becomes, how do I soil test that to make that interpretable? One of the situations I would suggest is wait till the actual plants are getting their roots down into those bands, and that can be done by positive affirmation, by digging them up and making sure you can see roots in where the bands are or below, or just understanding at what time it might reach that depth, and then doing a plant sample, because the plant is actually doing the sample and it will tell you whether it's seeing the effect of those bands or not. So, some of these placement issues or the irregular placement, the effect of those is uneven in the soil, but it could be resurrected by using the plant to actually tell us, is it seeing the change in management that we've made. Fertigation, where the soil root water bulb is the primary source of nutrients. Sampling the bulk soil only tells you what the roots might see partially when you've had rainfall. If it's fertigated in the roots bulb, then that's difficult to sample, although you could do it. But the plant is ultimately the one that's integrating these things, so it might be the best thing to sample. Where water infiltration distribution is uneven through the soil profile, ask the plant, its roots are doing the sampling. And where soil physical or biological constraints impact root structure, nutrient uptake, or plant growth rate. So if we've got something that's affecting the root system, the soil test won't detect that, particularly if it's physical or biological. Only the plant can say, I know the concentration's there, but I physically can't take it up. And this is the way it's reflecting in my chemistry in the plant. So thanks to Fertilise Australia and Fertcare for the opportunity to get involved in the plant guide and to Luke and the team to present this, and I'll pass over to Doris unless there's some burning questions. Luke?
I'd now like to introduce Doris. So Dr. Doris Blaesing is an associate with RMCG. She has extensive technical knowledge and experience in managing soil health and nutrition in annual and perennial production systems and combining a scientific, on-farm and environmental management perspective. She understands the methods and value of soil, plant and water sampling, analyses and interpretation to make good site-specific decisions on fertiliser inputs and soil amendments. She places great emphasis on understanding the individual objectives for taking samples and considering the many interactions that can influence results and decisions. Her work has shown that good soil and nutrient management foster economic, environmental sustainability and resource use efficiency. So we can see your screen, Doris, and you are still muted. Now you're right, so you're right to go, Doris.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and thanks, Chris. I get right into it, and I also want to just mention our vegetable soil and plant protection project. If people want some further information, there's a lot of information on the Soil Wealth website, but those who haven't seen it yet. And no, yep. So obviously the general principles explained by Chris previously all apply to horticulture. Horticulture can sometimes be a little bit more challenging because you have quite a diversity in crops. You deal with perennial crops where nutrients are also stored in the trunk and the roots, and you need to consider that. Production systems are variable, irrigation systems are variable, of course, and site-specific management is so much more important. And the reason why I mention is that the rewards of getting it right are usually higher, or the losses of not getting it right are, in a value sense, higher. And the nice thing in horticulture is because of the higher value, you sometimes have more things to play with as far as fertilizers are concerned. You're using foliar fertilizers, using all kinds of tricks, fertigation, to actually fix problems. Just one thing I want to highlight is whether it's broadacre crops or any other crops, is the effect insufficient nutrition can have on plant health. We often forget that, but often we see plants suffering or getting sick because they're not well, they don't have good nutrition. It's not always just a nasty disease hanging about. So it definitely is worthwhile thinking about that connection. And there's books written about it if anybody's interested. So I want to spend a little bit of time, on plant sampling, because why would you sample? And I'm just showing you this paddock of a harvested cauliflower crop. There's a lot of residue left, and it's like a slow release fertilizer. That crop had actually 170 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen just left in the crop residues. And it's very hard to actually get all that or capture all that in a soil test. There would also be, a good amount of potassium and phosphorus and other nutrients, especially potassium. And the soil test will not necessarily show that, especially in vegetable system where the next crop is put in as soon as you can. So it's really hard to actually nutrient budget based on a soil analysis for horticulture. That's why plant testing is so much more important in the sampling. The sampling guide has a lot of information, as Chris said, about when to sample, what to sample. So I don't want to bore you with all these tables. So I really encourage you to have a look at that. And the interpretation, I can see that most people don't sample plants because they find it difficult to interpret. However, I think as an agronomist or grower, you have to really use that tool to learn about your plant and your production system. And once you've done it for a couple of years, you find it quite exciting, I would think. So one thing I want to highlight is, especially in perennial crops, where you can see this scraggly roots with the blue lines. That's actually the drip irrigation water being colored in. And you can see that roots will mainly take up nutrients obviously where the water is. So our soil analysis is not going to really give us a good indication of what's happening in systems like that. And having excavated a lot of trees and orchards, this is quite common, that the tree roots are not necessarily where you actually take samples. It can be because of the way irrigation is managed, that actually most of the feeder roots are under the grass, in the interrow. We still sample in between the trees, so we can get all kinds of wrong information just relying on the soil test. And probably one exciting development over the last probably 20 to 30 years has been to not only use the dry tissue analysis in fruit, but also use sap analysis and use it very early in the season to determine whether the crop actually is balanced right at the beginning and to fix any problems really early. Talking about root systems, you can see the potato crops there. That the soil test would have been the same or could have been the same. However, the root system for a range of reasons can be quite different. So I'm a great believer in looking at root systems. And this is one of my favorite pictures because it's a very healthy root system, as you can see, with a very healthy rhizosphere. So this plant will be far more efficient in taking up nutrients than a plant that doesn't have that very good rhizosphere conditions around the root system. So the plants, and that photo actually has been sent to me from somebody who just solely relies on plant analysis, because he finds, in this case, in broadacre, it gives him better information. So again, just in summary, you get from the soil analysis, you get an idea of what potentially could be available. And I often had discussions with people about potassium and potassium levels in the soil, and potassium levels were absolutely fine in the soil. However, plants still ended up with deficiency and deficiency symptoms. And one of the issues is that if plants grow very, very rapidly, it can happen in potatoes, in cotton, in poppies. There's some rapid growth phases, and even though there's enough potassium there, it doesn't move quickly enough in the soil to support the plant. So an early plant analysis really can give an idea about whether the plant is going to run out of potassium before it actually is very visible. So probably the catchphrase is here: monitor to manage. If you do recipes and just go with what's always been done, you can get it 70% right. That's to actually really improve yield and quality. The soil and plant analysis are part of the tool. I know a grower, he grows capsicums. He spent $10,000 on a reasonably small area because the capsicums are in greenhouses. And he said, this is money worth spending because I get 4 or 5 times as much back from exactly knowing what the plants are doing and what they want. I often, when I do training in nutrition management, being asked why I don't show pictures of deficiency symptoms, and I just want to mention that quite often it's still used in presentations, in teaching, in books. The first thing is, if you look at the bottom left, magnesium and iron deficiency, you can't actually distinguish that. If you look at sulfur and manganese deficiency, it's very hard to, and actually you never want to plant that bad anyway. I mean, you kind of lost the plot. If you wait for calcium deficiency to show up in a product, it's far too late. And apples can do that in storage. You might, harvest the apples looking quite good, and just turn up like the right one there in storage. And the idea with apples is, fruit analysis is really helpful, and you can use either tissue or sap testing to see whether calcium uptake is adequate really early on. That's one thing we found with sap analysis in vegetables, in melons, in fast-growing plants. To actually do the analysis quite early on in the season really gives you the opportunity to fix things. Later in the season, it is harder. I've seen that with trace elements application after sampling tomatoes quite late in the season. You can get a result with foliar applications, but it only hangs on for a week or two. So feedback from agronomists also has been, if you want to test test early and hopefully test more than once, you could see the graphs that Chris had on, the difference in testing and growth stages and the influence of growth stages. And I know from actually being in a lab that the biggest thing that people don't put on their labels that they submit to the lab is the growth stage. So interpretation is really not possible if the growth stage isn't known. Selecting sampling areas, I think this area photo also tells you about sampling areas, and especially the NDVI image tells you a lot about sampling areas. So if you take soil or plant samples, it's always worthwhile checking out some aerial images to actually direct your sampling. There's often we get questions about, whether we should do plant tissue, like a dry tissue testing, where you can see the plant is dried and processed from a plant kind of powder, or you use sap testing where the petioles are usually sampled, again, from the youngest fully expanded leaves. I think this would be potatoes. And then the sap, this is an example of just the usual plant sap in a lab, is analyzed. And there's horses for courses and also preferences that people have. And one interesting thing I always found that if you look at plant sap, the colors you're getting, and quite interesting often if you're in a lab, you can see the different colors. This row could be from the same type of root, but it shows different colors, already indicating that there's a difference in plant health. So the sap testing is, from that point of view, quite good fun. One thing that also people think that sap testing is done with a handheld gizmo. I think that's quite flawed personally. Some people have a way to use it consistently and get indication of what they should do, but the dry tissue analysis or the sap analysis are all run on state-of-the-art modern equipment, and it's all the same equipment. So there's no difference in the analysis in a lab with both samples. The other reason why people don't want to sample for sap, for instance, is saying, oh, you always have to do it at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's also not really correct. You shouldn't do it when the plants are stressed, when it's really hot, really wet, when the irrigation is kind of over irrigated. So it basically applies also to tissue testing, dry tissue testing. The main thing is to get the right plant age. So if you use leaves that are too old or too young, that will give you a false information. But if you get the sampling right, you get quite good information on what's going on in the plant. And especially, as Chris so often said, the plant is an instrument that measures what's going on. And often people say, oh, my plant and soil analysis don't match. No, they often don't. So then it gives you, hopefully have an inquisitive nature, gives you an idea to say, what's going on here? For instance, if I see a plant analysis where potassium is quite low, I immediately actually look at sodium levels to look at salinity or sodicity problems. It's a really good indicator to see the impact of chloride or sodium on the crop. And then you can actually do some preventative measures to stop the plant really suffering. And that's really all I wanted to say. So hopefully everybody's got lots of questions. Thank you.